Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Gala webinar series. My name is Manuela Noske, and I'm the Communications Manager here at Gala. Gala is a global nonprofit trade association supporting the language industry. We're headquartered in Seattle, Washington, in the United States. And today we're going to have a presentation by Barbara Karsch. And we're so pleased each of you joined us from various locations all around the world to join us. I will hand it over to Barbara in just one moment, but first I have a few housekeeping items to go over. We have muted everyone's lines to cut down on any background noise. If you experience any technical difficulties, you can let me know by using your chat box, and I will work with you to troubleshoot them. If you have a slow internet connection, your audio may be disrupted. If that happens, you can use the number listed on the GoToWebinar panel to call in using your own phone. We are making a recording of this presentation, and you will be able to find it following the presentation on Gala's global website. All participants will receive a link. We will also post a PDF of the slide deck at the same location. Barbara will answer your questions at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to type them into your chat box throughout the webinar to get them into the queue. We will get to as many questions as we can with the time remaining at the end of the session. Also, as part of the webinar today, we will have 3 short polls, so please be prepared that you will be asked to answer a few questions. It goes without saying that your participation is not obligatory. Before we begin, I'd like to take just a few moments to introduce our speaker. Barbara Karsch is the owner of BIK Terminology, a terminology consultancy and training company. Since 2010, she has been providing terminology training, terminology development and implementations of terminology management systems for Microsoft, Intel, Facebook, the Council of the EU, and others. She draws on her extensive experience working in-house as English and German terminologist for Microsoft and JD Edwards. Barbara completed both a BA and an MA in translation and interpretation and has done PhD-level research in terminology management. She is an adjunct instructor at New York University and has taught at KU Leuven at Antwerp, Belgium, as well as the Middlebury Institute at Monterey and the University of Washington. As U.S. delegate to ISO TC 37, Barbara is leading the revision of ISO 12616, which is translation-oriented terminography. Barbara has dual citizenship from Germany and the United States and has moved back and forth between her home countries several times. And now, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Barbara for the remainder of the session. Barbara, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Manuela, and hello everybody around the world for this session on terminology management, the roles and skills involved in terminology work. As I was getting ready and Manuela and I talked a little bit, I told her that this is kind of a new view onto it, or rather a presentation that I have not given in this form before. So I pulled a lot of material together. And I have to see how much time it's going to take me, but there will be time at the end for questions. So I'm looking forward to that. Before we get a launch into the tasks, we need to, as always, talk about what is terminology work. Otherwise, if we can't agree on what we're talking about, it would be hard to identify the tasks that are related to that work. And once we have that down, we can look into what is or who is engaged in terminology work, and finally we'll look into the skills. Terminology work. You see a juggler here, and when I was transitioning from being a full-time translator to a part-time terminologist, I remember being at a party in Denver and being asked what I do for a living. And I said, well, I'm a translator, because I still didn't think of myself as a terminologist necessarily. And the person I was talking to said, oh, this is like somebody out of a circus. So it was really exotic for them to hear about somebody being a translator. And I thought a few years later, well, I wonder what that person would say if they heard that I'm fully focused on terminology work now. So it is certainly an area that, although part of technical communication, not one that we necessarily think of or do consciously think of all the time. So now I have a question right away for you. When you think of terminology work, what do you consider part of it? So Manuela is going to launch the poll, and if you don't mind checking all of the aspects that you think are part of terminology work, and I have just 4 examples, and they are not necessarily random, but they're just examples, and to get a little bit of an idea on what your perception of terminology work is. Naming part of it, is classification of concepts part of it, assessing synonyms, doing research work, or, and I have that in quotation, translation of terminology into another language. I'll give you just a little bit of time.
And I just closed it.
You should, all right.
Yeah. Can you see the results?
I cannot see the results.
Oh, okay.
No, but actually,
okay.
maybe if I, you know what, when I, yeah, on audience view, I can see it now. And I see it in a very small format. So I don't mind, if you don't mind reading it out to me, that would be great.
Yeah. So for naming, we have 79%, classification of concept 86%, assessing synonyms 79% again, research 100%, and translation into another language 93%.
Interesting that assessing of synonyms is the lowest one. So thank you very much for your participation and for reading it out to me, Manuela. So now, as some of you who were here maybe for my last webinar with Gala saw, I usually bring in a technical definition, and usually from a technical standard. Here it is a working draft standard for 1087, which is the technical terminology of terminology. So that's what this standard is about. And in that standard, and in this new draft that we're working on right now, we define terminology work as the work concerned with the systematic identification of concepts. So we first need to know what are the thoughts, the ideas, the concepts that we're talking about. Sometimes we don't necessarily identify or describe them, but we just collect them because others have already created them for us. Then we describe, as I said, we describe what is the concept, or how do we refer to it, the designations. We process it and put it into a database and present that information to others for use. So the work concerned with the systematic identification, collection, description, processing, presentation, or use of concepts and their designations. That's currently our technical definition of terminology work. I have a very simple view of the translation process. And of course, some translators are still in that very simple way. And there's a little bit of background noise, so I don't know whether we can mute the phone, just FYI. Of course, some translators still have this very, very simple process going on where they read the text, they understand it, then they do the research and find equivalents in the other language, they translate and edit. When we do terminology work or make this step explicit, we focus on this particular part in this simple process. And where we do it, or when we make it a separate step in the workflow, we do that because we have particular circumstances. That's not to say that a translator, freelance translator, wouldn't benefit from doing terminology work and making it this deliberate step and being more extensive than just researching, but also maybe documenting their terminology in a database. But it is really beneficial when you have a situation, and most of us work in these environments, where we have high volumes of text. So lots of words coming through, lots of repetition or updates to those texts as well. Another factor is when we have highly technically difficult terminology, or, and this is where I really became a terminologist. I worked for J.D. Edwards back in the 90s, and we had extremely poor translation software interfaces. So we really couldn't tell from the context, or didn't have any context, what a particular term could mean. And because there were around 60 translators and then later a full-time staff of terminologists, we decided we should make it this particular specific explicit step in the workflow and research all the source terminology and the concepts underlying it and putting it into the database. Because one of the things that happened in that scenario was that all translators would walk over to the writers and editors who would sit on the other side of the floor and ask the same question. And after the second or third or fourth or fifth translator came around, the writers, of course, got very tired of us. And so we decided to make it one step and focus the knowledge in a database. We also, in that setting, had a high number of users. And so that's another really great aspect to consider when you are thinking of doing terminology management. Most of us work in environments where documentation, the authoring of material, or the translation, usually the latter in any case, is being outsourced. And where, you know, we don't have that scenario anymore where you sit with the knowledge owners on maybe the same floor. Sometimes we also have fairly high turnover in our highly dynamic world, and so we lose the corporate knowledge, the knowledge of the subject material, and so that's another good reason to integrate terminology work as an explicit step. Or we have users with different backgrounds. So for example, at J.D. Edwards, we had a team of 5 German translators, or actually 6 even, and we all came with different expertise, different backgrounds. Not all of us were trained translators. Some of us were subject matter expert translators, which as a team was really great, but we could level the playing field or level the knowledge within the team by having that database for everyone to access. So in this more complicated or complex environment, dedicated people carry out what the translator does in the simple setting. And now we have achieved that the findings that we discovered during our research can be used multiple times. They can be used by many people at the same time and within seconds of the creation of an entry in the database. So that's really the benefit of doing terminology work and making it an explicit step, because terminology work happens anyway, whether we are conscious of it or not. All right, let's look a little bit at the tasks. And I first just throw a variety of tasks at you to give you an idea what we consider terminology work. Perform term extraction. Sometimes we do that with an automated, with a tool, or we do it manually. Depends on the size of the text usually, or also the availability of term extraction tools. Once we have identified new terms and names, we research them and look at the underlying concepts, and then we organize those concepts. That again is a way of stating this in a very explicit way, but anybody, any translator who does research always sets off the concepts that they find from other concepts. So they do this subconsciously anyway. It's just not always in the forefront of their mind. And in this presentation, I'll bring a lot of the things that happen anyway and make them more explicit so that our understanding as a whole in the industry grows about this subject area. Quite often we find existing definitions during our research, but we sometimes also have to author new definitions, or we just choose to, just to be very clear about our definitions. And in large environments anyway, we would need to do that. We document it in the database. We look at the different terms that we have come up with, specifically maybe target language terms, and see which one is the one that represents the concept the best for our environment, for our context, for our recipients. But sometimes we also have to create new terms. And it's always interesting when I work with my students at NYU and I mention to them that they maybe need to create new terms. They're always very impressed in a way that as translators, they will get to create new terms. It may not come up on a daily basis, but when it does come, you better be prepared and do this in an organized, in a systematic fashion, so that you're not the only one who understands the underlying concept, but your user audience or the audience of the readers of your translation understand it as well. So now we have these tasks organized by who does them, and that is more from a larger perspective. So not necessarily the user roles yet, but more the organizations or the individual parties involved in the translation workflow, at least in general. And again, it's more of a high-level view, and your specific scenarios might look just a little bit differently. It is generally only in the enterprise, and let me grab a pointer here, in the enterprise that new concepts are created and then also given new names. Any company that creates products will generally have an aspect to that product that is new. Otherwise, they would not be on the market. Innovation happens in these companies, and that's where new concepts come about. If at that point, the people who do this work also document it, then we would be all set, but that generally doesn't happen. And so somebody in the enterprise or somebody downstream, for example, at the language service provider, or if not at all, then the freelancer needs to identify the term and extract it. Then do the research, document it, maybe write definitions, also provide feedback on particular aspects of the term or name. Quite often in the larger environments, as terminologists or translators, we're asked to provide input on naming. Doesn't happen everywhere, but there are companies that actually get the teams together or send out names for review by target language professionals so that they hear the feedback on whether something will work in another market. And then these terminologies that are being created will be distributed as well. On the lower half of this particular box, you also see tasks that, if you're a terminologist in an enterprise, that you would be asked to do. And we won't go into all the details here because that could be a session almost on its own. But just so that you're aware that there is much more going on when you're located in the enterprise. If nothing happens on that company level or in a public organization, then sometimes language service providers are asked to do exactly what was covered here in this middle box, the term extraction, research, and documentation. So terminology work sometimes happens on the language service provider level. And again, if it doesn't happen there, then the freelancer is tasked with it. We can also look at that task, those tasks, from two different perspectives, and I already hinted a little bit on that. We have, on the one hand side, the workflow starting point where invention happens, innovation happens at a company, where new concepts and their designations are being created. Quite often, we as language professionals, predominantly in the translation industry or localization industry, we're not always involved in this step. And so for us, the workflow quite often starts with identifying terms or names in a text, researching them, documenting them, distributing them to others, or just using them. So those would be the two workflow starting points that we could look at. And the tasks and then also skills, as well as the players that, actually the players I will look at from an overall perspective, but the tasks of identifying, research, naming, documentation, distributing, and use in these phases, will focus mostly on these 6 red boxes and not so much on the innovation phase. So who is involved in all of this? Who are the players? I'd like to introduce a new distinction that we recently made, and actually when I think about it is new only in the way we name it. I'll read out or explain here what you see on the slide in a moment, but as part of our work on 12.6.16, we had to make this distinction. And yet when we research, we realize, or I realized that in 1999, Gerd Engel and Heribert Picht already wrote an article in a large encyclopedia on technical communication. And the article was called Terminologe, Beruf oder Funktion. This is a German book, of course. And they wondered in this article, is the terminologist, is that a profession or is it a role? So already then that distinction existed, that we had on the one hand side the aspect of terminologists being a full-time occupation, but we also had subject matter experts who really need to be involved in terminology work, or who are doing terminology work, but they're just not aware of it. And then we discovered, well, there are really other professions who also do terminology work. And so for 12.6.16, we came up with these distinctions here, where we say the terminologist is an expert who performs terminology work as their main function. And then we had to create another concept, in other words, and also a term for it, and we called it terminology worker. It's maybe not an ideal label just yet, but it would be the roles that somebody holds, for example, a language professional or other expert who does terminology work sometimes during their day, so as an ancillary function, and they also do other professional activities. When you look at this definition, would you consider yourself a terminology worker? Just out of curiosity, please participate in the poll that Manuela is launching right now.
And we'll give this just another 2 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I think we have stabilized. I closed it and I'm sharing. And
right.
Can you see the answer?
Okay. I can see, I think it's, what I cannot read, oh yeah, it's yes, and it's 70-some percent.
71%, and no is 29%.
Okay, right. Thank you very much. It's mostly to get you going a little bit about which aspects of your role might fall into terminology work already, and you're not necessarily conscious about it. Because as I said, many different roles in an organization, in a company, are involved in terminology work, but they don't necessarily think about it. It's not a bad thing, but generally when we're conscious about our tasks and are also aware of the underlying aspects of it, then we tend to do it better. We tend to do it in a way that is sort of longer lasting, that has if we think of naming, for example, maybe going back to my NYU students, when I talk about naming and term formation, and then they make them aware that there is a whole section of a standard on term formation, and they realize that you can go about it in a systematic way that sort of opens up a whole new world to them. So here you have a list or a circle of roles. We'll start up here with research and development. This is what R&D stands for. And of course, concepts are created by researchers. Concepts are created when innovation happens. So that particular department, the researchers in that department are definitely doing a form of terminology work, and they will never call it that way, and that's perfectly fine. But if we're aware of it, that this is where these concepts are being created, we may be daring enough as language professionals knock on their door and say, can we participate in your naming process, for example? There is a company in Switzerland, and for the life of it, I can't think of the name, but they do toilet flushing systems. I see them everywhere when I go to Europe. And they have terminologists in-house, and they are always part of the naming process. So when there is a new part being created in the laboratory there, then the terminologists are part of it to give it a systematic name so that not just the researchers understand what this new part does, but that the rest of the world can follow as well. Along the same lines, you have roles like product designers and product managers that do part of their time, they do terminology work. Most of us are sometimes painfully aware how much terminology comes out of marketing and branding. It has a particular angle, and so it's not always the most easily accessible for us as translators especially. And I think what's more is that sometimes lots of time goes into the creation of, let's say, slogans or product names, campaign names in the source language, and not the same amount of effort goes into that or is allowed to happen in other languages. And so that's sometimes a big gap that we have to close somehow. We also have lawyers involved. They might do copyright checks or trademarking checks, see whether particular names are already taken. Again, they don't necessarily think of it from a terminology work angle, but they are participating in that workflow and are essentially doing terminology work. Of course, our friends in the technical communicator department often help us. Then there are the localizers and translators who participate. Sometimes trainers not only use terminology in a company when they introduce a new product, a new feature to clients, to trainees, but they also invent new terminology. And then last but not least, our customers. They also are not just users of the terminology, they quite often give us good ideas on whether we named something right, or whether in their world, and often in their subject matter world, they would call a concept something else. So we better listen to them. I put the terminologist in the center because if you have that role defined, if you have a terminologist on board here, they need to sit at the center. They need to be in touch with as many of these roles as possible and work with them on creating new terms, documenting things, and so on. But I also put it in gray because I know that doesn't often exist as a full role. Now, if we look at who is involved in which task or which workflow phase, you have R&D, product designers, planners, and managers definitely here in the invention phase, and then also in the naming phase. Then we also have product marketing and the lawyers or the legal department involved in that. And then the question is, who documents all of this? And sometimes we have technical communicators who are tasked for a particular product team to document the information that was created upstream by these teams, but quite often that does not happen. And so if it doesn't happen, then that falls onto translators, or if there is a terminologist, again, sometimes we have the technical communicators who assist with that even in this later phase. They may not be involved with the invention and naming part of the house, but come in with the translation side of the house. We have people, for example, terminology PMs, distributing that terminology to the freelance translators, and then finally we have the translators using the terminology. All right, let's go on to the skills, and here I relied very heavily on 2 different resources, but mostly on the best practices folder that the German Terminology Association, DTT, created in first version in 2010, and then the second updated version in 2014. And by the way, the slide deck contains the references so that you will have them available later on. So let's look at some of the skills that are, or comprehensively on the list of skills that are necessary to fulfill the role of terminologist, but also to fulfill that aspect of a terminology worker's day that is spent on terminology work. And of course, as a terminology worker, just as the definition says, not everybody does everything and all the time, but some of these skills will be necessary for people who do terminology work in that ancillary fashion. We have to start with terminology theory, best practices, and the working methods. And I will go deeper into that in a second set of slides here in a moment. It is probably something that you read when you read what is necessary, but it's not often spelled out. And so I decided today to bring that a little bit closer to you and explain it a little bit more in depth. Project management skills, that's a lot more obvious for us. We understand what is involved in project management, or at least I think the group participating today is familiar with it. Of course, there are specific skills within a terminology project. Budgeting or just calculating the time is something that takes some practice, takes some experience for sure, but those are skills that I think we understand a lot better, and we don't need to dive more into detail right there. Of course, anybody who is involved in terminology work needs to have a little bit of tools understanding. And when I say a little bit, that's really an understatement. It is quite a bit. It is fairly technical to work with a database, to see how a database integrates with a translation environment or also with other environments, controlled authoring, for example. If we want the source language text to be in a particular format, linguistically that is, then we need to connect the database also to the controlled authoring environment. Furthermore, terminology identification and extraction skills. That is also not something that is easily taught. That is much more of something that you practice, you gain experience in, and learn more by doing almost. Terminology policy and planning comes in when you think about systematic naming once again. And yes, for the source language, that may be done by a marketing or branding department, but when you are involved as a translator or target language terminologist, then you need to see, how do I systematically name the products or the features, the campaigns, whatever other main ideas come up in a company, so that it's easily accessible for the users. And for that, you have to have some guidelines that need to be developed first and then systematically applied. Those were what I call purely terminology skills, but there are also skills from other fields. So for example, I mentioned tool skills, but there is more than that. There isn't just the terminology tool skills. There is also just simply computer skills. You need to be able to work with spreadsheets and other simple tools, the internet, research on the internet. Most of us have that, no problem at all, but we also sometimes deal with languages that are of minor distribution, and people may not have that yet. But they might be really excellent linguists in their native language. And so here are the linguistic skills that are necessary in your native language, but also in your working languages in general. Sometimes we have discussed can a terminologist, if you hire a full-time terminologist for in-house, be monolingual? In other words, do they need to necessarily have another language? It's possible because, of course, when you're an in-house terminologist, you deal with one language mostly. But it really helps if you understand what is involved in translation, and when you speak another language or have a good working knowledge in another language, to understand the problems. And so when I, for industry, looked for people to hire, we didn't make it a requirement necessarily, but it was a strong asset to have both two languages. Subject matter expertise is, of course, a benefit, and if you don't have it yet in the particular subject area, you should definitely acquire it. Here are some of the general and softer skills: common knowledge, problem-solving skills. People need to be precision-oriented. It's something that we underestimate a little bit. Most translators, of course, have that already as part of their job anyway. And so if they're now being asked to work on target language entries, they can transfer that skill fairly easily. But because there are still, the precision-oriented skill comes in and is meshed with, or has then other skills that are necessarily to do the terminology entries, sometimes there's just not enough brain capacity to really get the entry right. And of course, our main goal when we do documentation of terminological information in a database is to document it once and then never touch it again. And so if we have too many errors in entries and we have to go back and fix them, then our return on that investment goes out the door. People should be open and curious, good communicators, because a lot of it is networking, a lot of it is finding information, asking others in the company. And so those communication, networking, and social competencies are not to be underestimated. Here's another poll for us. Does your organization currently have someone who has some of these skills? And I give you 4 options, again, just for you to think about. Is it something that we do today, or we don't do it in-house, but we rely on vendors? We rely on freelance translators completely for this, or you simply don't know. Just think about it briefly.
I think we're stabilizing here, so I'm going to close the poll and share. So we have someone in-house, 67%. We rely on our vendors, 14%. We rely on our freelance translators, 10%, and I don't know, 10%.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you so much. And what I'm really pleased with is that the level of I don't know is so low. So some of you may really just not know, but just to think about it is wonderful. So thank you so much for participating here. As promised, a little bit more about the theory, and I'm probably going to run a little bit over, but I don't want to skip that since I have announced that we want to talk about theory. And as Terminorix puts it, and Terminorix is one of the organizations that you should pay attention to, that produces documents that spell out what are the skills. And they also, just like the best practices folder by the German Terminology Association, state very clearly that an in-depth understanding of terminology management theory, principles, and methods is necessary. But nobody spells out, or rather Terminorix does not spell out, what does that actually mean. And so I relied on the best practices folder a little bit more here but also on programs that teach terminology, of course. What is it that we cover when we talk about terminology theory? Some of it may be familiar to you and other things may be a little bit foreign, but let me just run through the list and explain it a little bit. In order to communicate about objects in the real world, we form concepts and then name them or give them terms. And that's how we refer to these objects in the world. So generally I'm on camera when I teach, and I hold up a particular object and then ask my students, what is this called? And that would be the designation that we give it. And then we look at, well, what concept does it belong to? And so when we are working in a terminology capacity, we need to be able to identify these three components, then analyze them, see what properties they have, and then see what all objects in that group share, what properties do they share, which are then called characteristics. So this is the classification approach to objects in the real world that are then grouped into concepts and named in a particular way so that we can communicate about them. That was a very succinct, very short introduction of the semantic triangle that underlies all of our working methods as well. These concepts that we identify are related to other concepts, and therefore we have concept systems. And as terminology worker, and specifically as terminologists, we need to understand what a concept system is and how concepts relate to one another. Based on that, we can create definitions, because within the definition we have, what definition has a particular structure, and it relies completely on understanding what the relation is to the higher category. Definition is always based on what we call a superordinate, and then distinguishing characteristic. How is this concept different from other concepts? That's the structure of or that's what we cover in a terminological definition. Much more easily to understand are the relations between designations, between terms, that is synonymy, homography, and equivalency. Synonymy is the relation between terms covering the same concept in one language, and equivalency goes into other languages. So a source language equivalent and a target language equivalent, that would be the same relation. And homography is just terms that are spelled the same way but have different meanings, and they can create big havoc in our communication. Here are the principles that I mentioned in my last talk as well, and they are highly complex and technical. I will just list them here. Again, it is something that as a full-time terminologist you absolutely need to understand, but even as somebody who does terminology work, for example, as a target language terminologist, you need to understand what term autonomy is, or data elementarity, for example. Then what do we mean with best practices? Well, we have various different approaches to terminology, and most of us work in the ad hoc approach. So ad hoc means we have a particular translation text, and we encounter an unknown term, and now we need to solve that problem. What is it? What does it stand for? And what do we call it in another language? That's an example of the ad hoc approach in terminology work. The systematic approach would be, we take a subject area, let's say some medical field, and we systematically document all the terminology, all the concepts and their terms for that particular field. We need to know the difference between the prescriptive versus the descriptive approach, and that too we don't always cover in the real world or are conscious about it. And so if we just describe what something is called in a database but not prescribe it, in other words, tell people here is the preferred term to refer to a concept, here is the deprecated term, so something that you should absolutely not use, then we have also not quite accomplished what we could accomplish with a terminology management system. The other aspects here are a little easier. Research, lots goes into that. We could spend a whole hour on that. Terminography, again, how do I document the terminology, how do I create a definition, modify existing definitions, and then document that in the database. That's what falls into terminography. And then the term and name formation principles, of which there are wonderful documents, and I share actually one in the reference as well. One of the things that I have not covered is the capacity to make and implement strategic decisions, and also in coordination with other units in an organization. This is one thing that the Terminorgs document highlights. So in other words, this aspect of management and strategy that certainly comes in for certain terminology workers as well as full-time terminologists. We're approaching the end of my talk, but there is a slide that I'd like to go through, and then we'll wrap up afterwards. It is a view that I developed in, well, the course of almost now 20 years of working with people in terminology roles, and I have observed them, and sometimes you learn how difficult it is to hire the right person for a terminology role, because some of the requirements are actually almost opposite. They are opposing requirements. For example, somebody who is a good researcher, who likes to work in peace and quiet and just research away, may not always be the best negotiator or the person in the middle of a bunch of experts negotiating what to call something. Same thing, although I think we see this go away in these, with the new generations that are coming about. It used to be that the people who were really good with language were not necessarily good with technology, but that I think is evening out a little bit. Another one that I call, you have to have the Fingerspitzengefühl, is a German term for this feeling that you have in the tip of your fingers that is fine, fine feeling, because you need to really identify details. But at the same time, you have to have really thick skin when people criticize your decisions on terminology or even on other areas. On the one hand side, you have to be really fast, work in a highly dynamic world, but quite often you also have to have this long-term vision and not be discouraged with the first setback. Obviously, we have the discrepancy or the approach of getting good quality, but also at the same time managing to enter enough quantity into your database and manage that. So that's not always easy for everybody either. On the one hand side, you have to have organizational skills and really be driven to organize. And where there is the need for organization, there is absolute chaos sometimes. So you need to bring that tolerance for the chaos. We have the native language expertise and the foreign language expertise, and that you can usually find no problem. You have to be self-critical, but at the right moment, self-critical and humble maybe. At the same time, you also have to be assertive sometimes in communication, in negotiations. On the one hand side, we have to be generalists, and at the same time, we have to be subject matter experts at the right time, at the right moment. So another one that is not always combined in one person, so to speak. We have to be detail-oriented, but we also have to have the big picture in mind, meaning we cannot get lost in the research of one particular concept for days because our deadline may be up, or somebody else will need the information. And finally, we have to have this good theoretical basis and then make quick pragmatic decisions in our day-to-day work. My claim is, though, that when you have this good theoretical basis, you can make the pragmatic decisions much more solidly and much more easily. How do we get there? Well, formal education, mentoring, but also just life experience then. And here, just to wrap up, how do companies do it? How do they get there? Well, sometimes they hire. It's not always easy, particularly in the United States, where we don't have an abundance of these skills, but they do exist. So maybe investing in hiring might be a little bit more expensive. You could also train staff, and various companies have done that. Or you could do nothing. That seems like the cheapest, but sometimes you have a big opportunity cost in that you are not aware of all the terminology, that work that goes on, and you're not capturing that information. So the risk may be a little bit higher there. So, quick summary. People with many different functions in an organization are involved in terminology work, in the naming, in the conceptual work, but also then in the authoring about these concepts, in the writing about these concepts. Sometimes we document it, so many people are involved, but there generally is a skills gap. So in other words, not everybody is aware that they're doing this work or how they could do it better. So the more conscious we're about it, the more successful communication generally is. And with that, I'm going to bring up the references just so that you can see them. But Manuela, now I would be ready for any questions there are.
And there are. Thank you for this fantastic overview, Barbara. We do have a couple of questions, and I expect more to come in. So let's take the first one here. In an enterprise, should it be down to the terminologist or the terminology manager to decide what becomes a term-based entry? Or should it be down to the people upstream, so product or content creation, or downstream, the translators, in which case terminologists only facilitate the term creation? What's your opinion?
That's actually an excellent question, and it is one that keeps coming up and that I hear over and over again. Who decides what needs to go into the database? I have developed a very, very pragmatic approach over the years, or formed that fairly early on, because you could sit with a bunch of people in a room and argue over this for minutes, if not hours. And then you think about each one of us, and I have actually done this in one particular scenario, each one of us costs the company about, I don't know, $100 an hour. And then you think it will take me 15 minutes to document the particular entry in the database. So my recommendation here is, if somebody in that content supply chain or in the translation supply chain asks a particular question about a concept, about a term, and you can easily document it correctly in the database, and that's really the key, that you can set up a correct entry in the database, I would say do it. Don't even spend the time arguing it, because especially in the large scale environments, if one person has the question, generally others will have the same question, or at least benefit from being able to access that information in the database. So I always say enter it, because those 15 minutes that you spend are immediately recuperated by one other person checking out the information.
Thank you. Thanks. We have a question about trademarks here. It's a general question. I mean, how do you deal with terminology when it involves trademarks?
That's a pretty broad question. So usually you have a legal department involved, and they will have done a lot of the legal work already. If not, I would get them involved, because it is a specialty really to worry about trademarks. For one thing, you don't know, is something trademarked? That needs to be established for the source language. And then is there a trademark in the target market as well? And that takes special skills, or skills that go a little bit beyond what a normal terminologist necessarily does. So I would definitely get the legal department involved, or also legal department maybe in the subsidiaries who can help with this in particular.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. We have a couple of questions about tools. So let me start with the first one here. Are you aware of any tools on the market that can bring together the various parties that are involved in the term creation lifecycle, such as the product teams that enter the concept, the localization teams that translate it, and then the local market stakeholders that validate them?
So rather than mentioning the names of tools, which are, there's always the risk that I forget somebody, some tool that is really good, I will mention the function of a tool that you need here, and that is a workflow function or a feedback function within a tool that allows particular parties to access the data and then leave feedback for the core team to process. There are certainly tools out on the market, and that's something that we can drill into at some other point. Without having done a more detailed approach right now, I hesitate to just throw out names. But that's a function, the workflow function, feedback functions is what you would be looking for in the tool that you would want to get. I can give you an example from when we introduced that feedback function at Microsoft in the proprietary tool that was created there. Within 3 weeks, we had the first lawyer commenting on definitions, and that's essentially what you want. So think of it as your company-owned Wikipedia, where people go to look up information, but also help to improve the information that is present. So rather than recommend a tool, I would recommend looking for that particular function.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We got a question here that may be of interest to the larger audience. An audience member is asking, in their organization, they have mostly ad hoc, so customer-based terminology strategy, and they feel that they now need to convert to a more subject matter-based approach. Do you have any suggestions how you approach that transformation?
Boy, this is customer-based approach versus a subject matter-based approach.
More, I think the emphasis here may be on ad hoc.
Okay.
So basically very little management to how do you become more structured in the management.
I see. Okay. Well, when we look in terminology management, in knowledge management in general, we generally look at the skills, which we covered today. We look at the processes, and we look at the technology that is supporting these processes. And we've covered the skills today. I would say look at the process that you have in place and see how you can firm them up, and then see how can you make it stronger by supporting it through tools. And of course, in order to get that done, you also have to have a core team. And now we're really at the how do you make the case for this explicit step of terminology management, and doing it rather randomly and doing it a little bit more systematically. I think, I believe in the last session that we did, in the last webinar we did on terminology for Gala, I talked a little bit about gather cases where, had you done it differently, you would have saved money, for example. Gather cases where, had you done it differently, more solidly, you could have saved time. You could have avoided errors. Things like that would help. And I know this may not be the best solution or the best answer to this. We'd have to drill down a little bit more into the details to see how we could make the process more solid and a little less ad hoc.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for that, Barbara. We have a few more questions that we won't be able to get to. I will pass them on to you. I think we also have in these questions some suggestions for additional webinars, which is great because that is going to be my next point to the audience. Apart from thanking you for joining us today, we would really appreciate it if you could take a moment to give us your feedback using the post-event survey. It is short, but that is the place where you can indicate what other areas and topics you're interested in, so we can refine our webinar program with your input. With that, I wish you all a good day and a good night, and I look forward to seeing you at another Gala webinar soon. Bye-bye.